Today we are continuing with the Hardy Boys, Hunting for Hidden Gold by Franklin W. Dixon. Chapter 5, The Strange Blue Light. The three detectives and Hank examined the warning message on the huge rock. "Big Al is a rough customer," Mr. Hardy said, frowning. "Be on your guard at all times." "We'll watch out, Dad," Frank promised. He and Joe shoved the boulder outside and looked up the hill. The moon had set and the mountainside was shrouded in darkness. "No telling if anyone's up there," Joe muttered. The two boys shivered in the icy wind and then squirmed through the hole into the burned kitchen. Meanwhile, Frank pulled on warm clothes, went out to a lean-to, and brought back a tarpaulin. The boys helped him nail it over the hole in the wall and then set up the stove. "That'll do till the morning," Hank said. Frank and Joe were up as soon as it was light. After a quick breakfast, they climbed the steep, snow-covered slope behind the shack, following the trail plowed by the huge boulder. The boys soon found a deep gorge where the stone had been pried out of the hillside. "Somebody used a crowbar to get it going," Joe said, kneeling on the ground. "And here are some traces of red paint," Frank pointed out. They scouted around thoroughly and noticed the snow had been disturbed, as if to cover tracks. "Whoever pried that stone loose," Frank said thoughtfully, "may have come from a town rather than a hideout in the hills." "Why?" "Because it's not likely that anyone hiding up in the mountains would have red paint on hand. The person who did this probably got it at the village store. Maybe Big Al has an agent in Lucky Lode." The boys walked up the hill. The undergrowth at the top was parted and broken. "Somebody forced his way through here," Frank said. They followed the trampled brush to a trail which led along the wooded ridge, paralleling the main street of Lucky Lode below them. Soon they spotted a narrow path leading down into a small community. "The man we are after could have come this way," Frank said. "We'd better scout for clues." Slowly he and Joe walked down the steep, narrow trail. There were footprints, but these were too jumbled to be of any significance. They reached the bottom without finding anything else, then climbed back to the top and continued along the ridge. After a while, the boys emerged into a clearing. Before them lay an old cemetery. They crawled through a gap in the dilapidated wooden fence and walked silently among the gravestones. From the bleak, windswept spot, they could see all of Lucky Lode in the valley below. The old part of town ended directly under the cemetery. "Look at these, Frank," Joe called from where he had knelt beside a double-headed tombstone. "John and James Colson," Frank read. "Mike Onslow's partners." "I guess they came to Lucky Lode to try for another stake," Joe said. "You're probably right," Frank replied. The boys decided to go into town and headed for the cemetery gate. Coarse brush grew up around the ornate posts. Frank passed through, but Joe was pulled up short. "Wait," he said. "I'm caught." Burrs, big burrs, clung to his trousers. Fumbling with heavily gloved fingers, he managed to get free. Together, he and Frank pulled out all the burrs, and the brothers scrambled down the slope. At the foot, they saw the deserted gray-weathered buildings. As they walked along the old wooden sidewalk, the boards creaked, and the wind rattled the loose doors and shutters. "This end of Lucky Lode's a real ghost town," Frank remarked. "Somebody lives here, though," Joe replied. He pointed ahead to a tumble-down house. A pale stream of smoke issued from the chimney. Suddenly, the door cracked open and a rifle muzzle pointed out. It was aimed straight at the boys. Frank and Joe halted, not knowing whether to drop to the ground or run. But nothing happened. At last they moved forward cautiously. The muzzle followed and the Hardys, until they came abreast of the porch. Then the door was kicked open and an old man jumped out, aiming a weapon at them. Frank and Joe stopped. "What are you doing here?" the white-haired man demanded curtly, his eyes squinting suspiciously. We're visiting," Frank said in a friendly tone. "We're from the east," Joe went on, "staying with Hank Shale." The old man lowered the rifle. "Oh," he said, relieved. Any friend of Hank Shale's is a friend of mine. Come on in." Did you expect someone else?" Frank asked, as the boys followed the old man into the shack.
Don't know, he snapped. Fellow can't be too careful around here. There's funny things happening on the cemetery hill.
The boys found themselves in a plainly furnished room heated by a wood stove. They introduced themselves, and their host said,
My name's Ben Tinker.
He pointed to 2 wooden chairs near the stove.
Sit down and warm up.
What did you mean by funny things going on in the cemetery? Frank asked him.
Well, it's been haunted, Ben said flatly. Has been for the past 2 weeks.
Haunted? Joe echoed. How?
Sometimes late at night a blue light blinks on and off up there. I've seen it, the old man explained. Because I'm a night owl and I like to breathe the air just before turning in.
Has anyone else seen the light? Frank asked.
Doubt it. In Lucky Lode, nobody's out late at night. But that's not all, Ben went on. About an hour after the light show, somebody walks past here. I think it's Charlie's ghost. Charlie used to play piano in the Peacock Dance Hall next door. He was killed in a gunfight here 40 years ago and buried up on Cemetery Hill.
The Hardys were mystified. Why do you think it's Charlie's ghost, Ben? Frank asked.
Because some nights I hear the piano. It's still there. It's sort of tuneless, like when Charlie let his fingers wander over the keys.
When was the last time you saw the blue light? Frank queried.
Night before last.
You don't really believe it's a ghost, do you? Joe said.
Might be, then again, maybe not. Somebody might be up to some monkey business, Ben admitted. That's why I keep this handy.
He pointed to the rifle leaning against the wall. Frank, on impulse, asked the old-timer, Do you know anything about John and James Colson?
Sure do. They died in a mining accident about 25 years ago after some highbinder stole a lot of gold from them.
Oh, we'd like to hear the story, Frank said quickly. Ben's rambling account of the Lone Tree incident agreed with the version the Hardys had heard from Mike Onslow. What happened to Bart Dawson? Joe asked.
Can't say for sure, was Ben's reply, but he must have kept the gold. I saw him in Helena a couple of years after, and he acted like he didn't know me. Why would he have done that if he hadn't been guilty?
The Hardys exchanged glances. It certainly sounded as though Mike Onslow's ex-partner had absconded with the gold. The brothers got up to leave, and Frank said, Thanks for telling all this, Ben.
Anytime, boys. Come back again, the man urged. But stay away from that graveyard.
As the boys walked down the main street towards the populated part of Lucky Lode, Frank suggested that the blue light could be a signal. I think so too, Joe agreed. Cemetery Hill is clearly visible from everywhere in town. It would also be an ideal place for Big Al to signal a spy if he had one in Lucky Lode, Frank remarked. Ben said the light had been only around for a couple weeks, Joe added, and that's about the length of time Dad thinks Big Al has been hiding out near here. The footsteps Ben hears could be a spy returning to town after meeting Big Al in the cemetery, Frank speculated. But what about the piano playing in the deserted dance hall? Joe asked. Maybe it's Ben Tinker's imagination? By this time, the boys had reached the business section of Main Street. Frank stopped in front of the general store. Let's go in and see if we can find out anything about that red paint. Inside, a husky man stood behind the counter, slitting open cartons with his pocket knife. Frank asked him if he were the owner.
I am. Jim Brooks the name.
Frank and Joe told him who they were, and he introduced the boys to several men seated around the pot-belly stove. The Hardys noticed that the town post office, telephone switchboard, and telegraph office were also in the store. You must know everything that's going on in town, Mr. Burke, Joe said, smiling.
That's right.
The man answered with a wink. Could you tell us which stores here stock red paint? Frank asked.
Burke chuckled. It's the only store here that there is. I carry it. Do you want some?
No, Joe said. We'd like to find out if anyone bought red paint in the past few weeks.
No one, Burke told him promptly. I'd remember, because I don't sell much of it.
Why? While Frank described the boulder attack on the Hanks cabin, he and Joe watched their listeners' faces. None showed any sign of guilt. The Hardys talked about meeting Ben Tinker and asked if anyone else may have seen a blue light at the top of Cemetery Hill. Burke laughed. Ben Tinker's always imagining things. One of the other men guffawed. A couple of weeks ago, he was seeing men from outer space. The Hardys did not believe this, but made no comment. They left the store and went back to their cabin. Here they found Hank Shale and their father repairing the damaged wall. "You better take it easy, Dad," Joe said with concern. "Oh, I haven't been exerting myself." Fenton Hardy grinned at his son. "I have to find some way to work off a little energy." While Hank fixed lunch, Joe and Frank related what they had found.
Ben is an old man, Hank put in as he dished out sizzling plates of ham and eggs. But he is not loco. Still, the whole story, blue lights and all, might just be his imagination.
That afternoon, the boys insisted that their father remain quiet while they helped Hank rebuild the cabin wall. By nightfall, the job was done. While they were relaxing in front of the fire after supper, Hank told the boys where they could rent horses to search for Big Al's hideout.
"I only have my mare, Daisy," he added, "and she's none too spry and young."
"There are a number of old abandoned mines in the area," Mr. Hardy told his sons. "I suggest you investigate them."
"But watch out for Tommyknockers," Hank warned with a grin.
Tommyknockers? What are they? Joe asked.
"Some kind of old gnomes or spirits or such like that live underground. Old-time miners used to say that if you heard one knocking, it meant there was going to be an accident."
"Okay, if we hear any, we'll watch our step," Frank promised jokingly. "By the way, we'd like to search the Lone Tree area. Where was Mike Onslow's claim located?"
"Nobody knows anymore," Frank said, scratching his head. "The Lone Tree territory is too big for you fellows to cover alone."
He drew them a sketch, showing the location of Lone Tree and the deserted mines in the area. Frank and Joe decided which ones they would try the next day. Later, the brothers walked down to the livery stable on Main Street and rented horses for their expedition. The boys rode back to the cabin and stabled the animals in Hank's lean-to. When they returned, Hank and Mr. Hardy were asleep, but the boys sat up for a while and discussed the mystery. They became aware that the wind had risen and was whipping around the cabin. "We better look at the horses," Frank suggested. They bundled into their heavy jackets and went outside. The lean-to was snugly built, and the animals seemed comfortable. Satisfied, Frank and Joe started back. As they rounded the corner of Hank's cabin, they stopped short. "Look!" breathed Joe. Clearly visible on the top of Cemetery Hill was a winking blue light.